Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you heartfelt tales of love, resilience, and second chances. In today's story, a wealthy man's encounter with a struggling young woman changes not only his life but also the lives of his withdrawn son and her long-lost brother. Together, they navigate a journey filled with challenges, redemption, and the power of family bonds. This inspiring tale will remind you that even in the darkest moments, hope can shine through. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to start today's story with us on Life Stories. Let's dive in. It was one of those evenings when the rain seemed unending, drenching the city streets and blurring the world into a swirl of lights and shadows. I sat quietly in the back of my car, gazing out of the window as the windshield wipers struggled against the relentless downpour. New York City felt distant, almost cold, as if its towering buildings and bustling streets had shrunk into irrelevance. My driver, Marcus, navigated the slippery roads with care, his brow furrowed in concentration. I was lost in my thoughts, as I often was these days. Despite all I had accomplished, my success as a businessman, my name spoken with reverence in the most exclusive circles, there was an emptiness that lingered, gnawing at the edges of my existence. Nothing could fill the void left by my wife's passing, and nothing could ease the pain of watching my only son, Michael, retreat further into himself each day. His laughter, once so bright, had been replaced by silence and a fear I couldn't comprehend. Michael was the only reason I kept going, and yet, I felt powerless to help him. Suddenly, the car jolted to an abrupt stop, pulling me out of my thoughts. Marcus turned to me, his face marked with concern. "Sorry, Mr. Carter," he said. "There's someone in the middle of the road." I leaned forward, squinting through the rain-streaked windshield. At first, it was difficult to make out, but then Marcus switched on the high beams, and the scene became clear. A young woman stood in the pouring rain, her clothes clinging to her frail frame. Beside her was a little boy, his cries audible even through the roar of the storm. She had positioned herself as a shield, her arms wrapped protectively around him as if her own body could keep the cold and wet at bay. There was something about her that struck me, something raw and genuine. She reminded me, in a way that was almost painful, of my wife. I could see it in the way she tried to comfort the boy, her desperation and strength merging into one. Without hesitation, I opened the car door. Marcus called out, urging me to stay inside, but I ignored him. The rain hit me like a wall, soaking through my clothes in seconds, but I kept moving. The woman looked up, startled as I approached, her wide eyes filled with both defiance and vulnerability. "What are you doing out here?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended, trying to be heard over the storm. She hesitated, her lips trembling from the cold. He was lost," she said softly, gesturing to the boy who clung to her side. "I found him in an alley. I didn't know what to do. I just wanted to keep him safe." Her words were simple, yet they carried a weight that pressed against my chest. She was soaked, shivering, and clearly had no one to help her, yet her concern was entirely for the child. I took in her appearance, her tattered clothes, the exhaustion etched into her face, and wondered how someone in her position could still have such selflessness. "What's your name?" I asked, my tone softening. "Emily," she replied, her gaze steady despite the circumstances. I don't have anywhere to go." "But she looked down at the boy, her voice breaking. "He needed someone." For a moment, I didn't speak. I didn't know what compelled me, but I found myself saying something that surprised even me. "Come with me." Emily stared at me, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Why?" she asked, her voice cautious. "I think you can help me," I said, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess them. "My son, Michael, he's scared, too. He needs someone who can understand him. Someone like you." Her hesitation was palpable. I could see the thoughts racing through her mind, the uncertainty, the fear of trusting a stranger. But there was also something else, hope. Finally, she nodded. A slight, almost imperceptible motion. "Okay," she whispered, though her voice carried the weight of exhaustion and resignation. "But just until I can figure out what to do next." I turned to Marcus, who had been watching the scene unfold from the car. He quickly got out to help Emily and the boy into the vehicle. Once inside, the atmosphere was thick with silence. Emily sat curled in her seat, holding the boy close as if afraid to let go. I stole glances at her through the rearview mirror, trying to piece together who she was. She seemed so small, almost fragile. Yet there was a quiet strength about her that I couldn't ignore. When we arrived at the mansion, the contrast was striking. The warm golden lights of my home illuminated the driveway, casting the towering structure in an almost ethereal glow. Emily stepped out of the car hesitantly, her eyes wide as she took in her surroundings. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My home," I replied simply. "You're safe here." As we entered, Marina, my head housekeeper, appeared in the doorway. Her expression shifted quickly from surprise to suspicion as her eyes landed on Emily. "Who is she?" Marina asked sharply, her tone carrying an edge I didn't care for. "She's my guest," I said firmly, brushing past her. "She'll be staying for a while." Marina's lips tightened, but she said nothing more. I guided Emily to a modest guest room, giving her space to settle in. Before leaving, I turned to her and said, "Tomorrow, I'd like you to meet Michael. I think you might be able to help him." Emily looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of uncertainty and determination. "I'll try," she said softly. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the rain, I couldn't shake the image of Emily standing in the storm, shielding the boy with everything she had. There was something about her, a spark of resilience and kindness that was rare in this world. I didn't know what had brought her to that point, but I felt, for the first time in a long while, that perhaps she wasn't the only one who needed saving. Morning arrived quietly, the rain giving way to a pale winter sun. The house, normally wrapped in silence, felt different with Emily's presence. I wasn't sure what I had expected when I offered her shelter, but there was a tension in the air that I could sense. Marina, whose authority in the household was often left unchallenged, was far from pleased. I caught her throwing glances at Emily, her lips tight with disapproval, but I chose to ignore it. As I waited in the dining room, my thoughts were focused on Michael. He had barely smiled since his mother passed, and his days were a blur of anxiety and withdrawal. The boy I had once played catch with in the garden had retreated so far into himself that I feared I might never reach him again. Emily's presence felt like a desperate gamble, but one I couldn't ignore. When Emily finally emerged from the guest room, she looked different, not polished, but composed. She had tied her damp hair into a loose ponytail and was wearing a clean set of clothes Marina had begrudgingly provided. Her steps were hesitant as she entered the dining room, her eyes scanning the space as though she couldn't quite believe she was here. "Good morning," I said, breaking the silence. "Good morning," she replied softly, her voice steady but cautious. I gestured to the table, laden with fresh fruit, coffee, and warm bread. She hesitated, her gaze lingering on the food. Before finally sitting down, she barely touched her plate, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. "I want to thank you for last night," I began. "What you did for that boy in the rain, it was selfless. Not many people would have stopped to help." Emily glanced up, her expression unreadable. "It didn't feel like a choice," she said. "He needed someone. I couldn't just walk away." Her words resonated with me, though I wasn't sure why. "Michael, my son," I said after a pause. "He's been through a lot. I think he could use someone like you." Her eyes flickered with uncertainty. "I don't know if I'm the right person," she said, her voice faltering. "I'm just trying to figure things out myself." Sometimes, I replied. The best people to help others are the ones who understand what it's like to struggle. Before she could respond, Marina entered the room, her presence like a sudden cold draft. Mr. Carter, she said briskly. Michael is ready. I nodded and turned back to Emily. Come with me, I said. You'll understand when you meet him. Michael's room was on the second floor, a space filled with toys and books that now sat untouched. He was sitting on the bed when we entered, his small frame hunched as he flipped aimlessly through the pages of a book. His dark hair fell over his eyes, but I could still see the weariness in his expression. Michael, I said gently, this is Emily. She's going to spend some time with us. Michael didn't respond, his focus fixed on the book. Emily hesitated, then stepped closer. She crouched down to his eye level, her movements slow and deliberate. Hi, Michael, she said softly. I'm Emily. He glanced at her briefly, his expression guarded. Emily didn't push, didn't try to force a response. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the floor, leaving a comfortable distance between them. I like stories too, she said after a moment, nodding to the book in his hands. What's your favorite? Michael didn't answer, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, curiosity. Perhaps. Emily stayed there, her presence calm and unthreatening, as if waiting for him to decide when to let her in. I watched from the doorway, my chest tightening with a strange mix of hope and apprehension. For the first time in months, I saw a small crack in the walls Michael had built around himself. When I left them, Emily was still sitting on the floor, her voice low as she talked to him about stories and adventures. Michael hadn't said a word, but he was listening. Later that evening, I checked on them again. The sight that greeted me left me speechless. Michael was asleep, his head resting against Emily's arm. She sat still, her expression soft and serene, as though she didn't dare move for fear of waking him. I stepped into the room, and she looked up, her eyes meeting mine. He just drifted off, she whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. You have a gift, I said quietly, unable to keep the awe from my voice. She shook her head. I don't know about that, she replied. I think he feels what I used to feel. Like the world's too big and too scary, I guess. I just wanted him to know he's not alone. Her words lingered in the air, heavy with truth. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Finally, I nodded. Thank you, Emily, I said, my voice thick with emotion. As I watched her sitting there with Michael, I realized something profound. This woman, who had entered my life so unexpectedly, wasn't just helping my son, she was helping me. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope, a faint but undeniable light breaking through the darkness that had consumed our lives. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about Emily's quiet strength, her compassion, and the way she had connected with Michael in a way no one else had. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I dared to believe it could be something better. The next few days brought a quiet yet noticeable shift in the mansion. Emily quickly fell into a routine with Michael, spending hours by his side in his room or walking with him through the garden. Her calm presence and gentle way of speaking seemed to draw something out of him that no therapist or family member had been able to reach. It wasn't as though Michael transformed overnight, but there were subtle signs that he was beginning to open up. He'd sit closer to Emily when she read to him, occasionally murmuring a quiet response when she asked a question. Once, I even heard him laugh, a sound I hadn't heard in years. But as Michael began to bloom under Emily's care, a storm was brewing elsewhere in the mansion. Marina, ever watchful and controlling, had grown increasingly displeased with Emily's presence. I noticed her sharp glances at Emily during mealtimes and the way her lips pursed whenever Emily walked into a room. One morning, as I was reviewing some work in my study, Marina knocked sharply on the door. I barely had time to respond before she entered, her expression a mask of forced politeness. Mr. Carter, she began. May I speak with you about recent developments? I set my pen down and looked at her, already sensing the direction this conversation was about to take. Go on. It's about Emily, she said, her tone laced with disapproval. I understand you brought her here to help with Michael. But don't you think it's a bit unorthodox? We don't know anything about her, where she comes from, or what her intentions might be. Her words ignited a flicker of irritation, though I kept my voice even. She's been nothing but kind to Michael, I said firmly. That's all that matters to me. Marina's eyes narrowed slightly, though she quickly masked it with a concerned expression. But don't you think it's risky? You've entrusted her with Michael, your only child, without knowing if she's trustworthy. She could be anyone. Mr. Carter. A grifter. Even. Enough. I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. Emily has done more for Michael in a week than anyone else has in years. If you have concerns, keep them to yourself. I won't hear another word against her. Marina's lips tightened. And for a moment, I thought she might argue. But instead, she bowed her head slightly and muttered, Of course, sir. She left the room, her movements stiff with suppressed anger. The confrontation left me unsettled, though I pushed the thought aside. Marina had been with the family for years, but her jealousy was misplaced. I trusted Emily, or at least, I wanted to. That evening, I found Emily sitting with Michael in the library. She was reading aloud from a children's book while he leaned against her shoulder, his eyes half closed in contentment. The sight warmed something deep within me, and I hesitated in the doorway, not wanting to disturb them. Eventually, Emily noticed me and gave a small smile. He's getting better, she said quietly, brushing a hand through Michael's hair. I think he just needed someone to see him. Really see him. I stepped closer, my gaze shifting between her and Michael. And you're the one who managed to do that, I said softly. Her cheeks flushed faintly, and she looked down. It's not just me, she murmured. It's you, too. He knows how much you love him, even if he doesn't say it. Her words struck a chord I hadn't expected. For so long, I'd felt like I was failing Michael, like no amount of love or effort could reach him. But Emily's quiet reassurance felt like a lifeline. Thank you, I said simply, my voice heavy with sincerity. She smiled again, a small but genuine expression that lit up her face. He's a good kid. He just needs time. As I watched her with Michael, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Emily had brought a warmth into the mansion that had been missing for far too long. But that warmth was not shared by everyone. The next morning, as Emily was preparing breakfast for Michael in the kitchen, Marina entered with her usual air of authority. The tension was immediate, crackling in the air like static electricity. Can I help you? Emily asked politely, though I could sense her unease. Marina crossed her arms, her expression cold. Just make sure you don't take anything that doesn't belong to you, she said curtly before walking away. Emily stood frozen for a moment, her hands trembling slightly. It was clear that Marina's words had stung, though she didn't let it show. When I heard about the encounter later, my anger flared. I confronted Marina once again, warning her to treat Emily with respect. But her response was vague and insincere. It was clear that Marina was determined to undermine Emily, though I couldn't yet understand the depths of her resentment. That night, as I sat in my study, I couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was brewing. Marina's hostility was growing bolder. And while Emily seemed to take it in stride, I worried about how far Marina might go. For now, I could only watch and wait, hoping that whatever storm was coming, Emily would have the strength to weather it. The following days brought an unsettling quiet to the mansion. On the surface, everything seemed to settle into a routine. Emily spent most of her time with Michael, whose progress continued to surprise me. He had started smiling more often, his once withdrawn demeanor softening under Emily's patient care. At times, I found them laughing together over something as simple as a silly book or a shared story. It was a kind of warmth that hadn't touched the house in years. Yet, beneath that warmth, there was a chill, a feeling that something was off. Marina's presence loomed like a shadow. Though she continued to perform her duties, there was a tension in her every movement, a sharpness in her words that she didn't even bother to conceal anymore. One afternoon, I returned to the mansion earlier than usual, intending to surprise Michael and Emily. As I made my way through the hallways, I overheard low voices coming from the kitchen. I paused, recognizing Marina's clipped tone. "She doesn't belong here," Marina was saying. Her words were sharp, laced with disdain. "Mark my words. Something isn't right about her." A second voice responded, one of the staff members. Though I couldn't tell who. "But she's been so good with Michael. Don't you think Mr. Carter knows what he's doing?" Marina scoffed. "William might be too blind to see it. But I'm not. That girl is hiding something. And I'm going to find out what it is." The conversation sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't linger to hear more. Instead, I turned and headed toward Michael's room, my mind churning with unease. Marina's jealousy was no longer just a nuisance, it was becoming a threat. That evening, as Emily read to Michael, I found myself watching her more closely. She had become such an integral part of our lives in such a short time. Yet I realized how little I knew about her. Where had she come from? What had brought her to that rain-soaked street? I trusted her. But Marina's words lingered like a whisper of doubt. Later that night, I decided to install a monitor in Michael's room. It wasn't about spying. I told myself it was about ensuring his safety. I didn't want to believe that Emily could pose any danger. But I needed to be certain. For the next few days, I watched discreetly. What I saw only deepened my admiration for her. Each night, after putting Michael to bed, Emily would sit by his side, her voice soft as she told him stories, not the usual fairy tales, but pieces of her own life. She spoke of growing up in foster homes, of the loneliness and fear she had felt, and of her determination to find her younger brother, Jack, who had been separated from her when they were children. Her words were raw, filled with pain and resilience, and they seemed to resonate with Michael in a way nothing else had. Sometimes she would pause, her voice trembling with emotion, and Michael would reach out, placing a small hand on hers as if to comfort her. It was a quiet, mutual healing, a bond forged through shared vulnerability. One night, after finishing a story, Michael asked, "What if you never find your brother?" Emily fell silent for a moment, her gaze distant. Then she smiled softly and said, "Then I'll keep looking. Because when you love someone, you don't give up. Not even when it feels impossible." Those words stayed with me. They were a reflection of everything Emily had shown us since the day she arrived, her strength, her kindness, and her unwavering determination. But while Emily's bond with Michael grew stronger, Marina's resentment deepened. Her presence became colder, her smiles sharper, and her interactions with Emily increasingly hostile. The staff, who once greeted Emily warmly, began to act differently. They whispered behind her back, their gazes filled with suspicion. It wasn't long before I discovered the source of the shift. Marina had started spreading rumors, subtle but insidious, suggesting that Emily couldn't be trusted. She hinted that certain small items in the house had gone missing. Though no one could confirm it, the accusations were baseless. But they were enough to plant seeds of doubt among the staff. One afternoon, I found Emily in the kitchen, preparing a snack for Michael. She seemed quieter than usual, her movements slower, almost hesitant. "Everything all right?" I asked, stepping into the room. She glanced at me, her expression guarded. "It's nothing," she said quickly, though her voice betrayed her. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Emily, if something's wrong, you can tell me." For a moment, she hesitated, then sighed. It's Marina, she admitted. She's been making things difficult. The way she looks at me. The things she says, it's like she's waiting for me to mess up. Her words sent a surge of anger through me. I'll talk to her, I said firmly. No, Emily said quickly, shaking her head. It'll only make things worse. I don't want to cause any more trouble. The fact that she was willing to endure Marina's hostility without complaint only strengthened my resolve to protect her. Marina's behavior was unacceptable, and I wouldn't allow it to continue. That night, I reviewed the monitor footage again. What I saw was not just proof of Emily's sincerity, but something far more profound. Her connection with Michael wasn't forced or calculated, it was genuine, born from a place of understanding and empathy. As I turned off the monitor, a thought occurred to me: perhaps it wasn't just Michael who needed Emily. Perhaps we all did. But even as I resolved to stand by her, I couldn't shake the feeling that Marina's schemes were far from over. The mansion, once a sanctuary, now felt like a battlefield, and I could only hope that Emily's quiet strength would be enough to withstand the storm that was coming. The tension in the mansion reached a boiling point over the next few days. Marina's resentment toward Emily had grown into something more deliberate, and the atmosphere around her became almost suffocating. The staff, once welcoming, had shifted to cold politeness, their whispers filling the quiet corridors. Emily, though she remained kind and calm, was beginning to feel the weight of it all. Michael, however, was oblivious to the undercurrents of hostility. With Emily by his side, his world was growing brighter. He laughed more, asked questions, and even began venturing outside the mansion for short walks in the garden. His transformation was undeniable, and it made Marina's disdain all the more baffling. Then, one rainy afternoon, everything changed. I was in my study, catching up on work, when Marcus, my driver, knocked on the door. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice uneasy. "There's something you need to see." I followed him to the foyer, where Marina was standing, her expression a mix of triumph and feigned sorrow. In her hands was one of her most expensive silk dresses, adorned with intricate beading. It was unmistakably hers, a gown I had seen her wear at a gala months ago. Now, it was crumpled and tucked under her arm, as if hastily retrieved. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Carter," Marina began, her voice laced with practiced regret. "But I felt it was my duty to bring this to your attention." I folded my arms, already bracing for whatever accusation she was about to make. "What is it, Marina?" She glanced over her shoulder. Ensuring we had an audience, several members of the staff lingered nearby, their curiosity barely concealed. "This dress," she said, holding it up for emphasis, "was hidden in Emily's wardrobe." The room went silent, save for the soft patter of rain against the windows. My jaw tightened as I stared at the dress, then back at Marina. "You went into her room?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. Marina's eyes widened slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I was looking for something else when I noticed the wardrobe door ajar. I couldn't ignore it, Mr. Carter. For the sake of the household, I had to investigate." I didn't believe her for a second. Marina's calculated movements and the self-satisfied glint in her eye were enough to confirm my suspicions. Still, the staff was watching, their expressions a mixture of doubt and intrigue. I needed to act carefully. "Where's Emily?" I asked. "She went to the pharmacy to pick up Michael's medication," Marina said smoothly. "Convenient timing, don't you think?" I ignored her insinuation and turned to Marcus. "Tell Emily to meet me in the library when she gets back," I instructed. As the staff dispersed, I returned to my study, my thoughts racing. Marina's accusation was absurd, but the damage it could cause was real. The staff's loyalty to her meant that whispers would spread quickly, and even if Emily were innocent, which I had no doubt she was, it would be difficult to undo the harm. But there was one advantage Marina didn't know I had: the monitor I had installed in Michael's room. It not only captured footage of the room itself but also a portion of the hallway outside, including the entrance to Emily's door. I sat at my desk and began reviewing the footage from the past day. My heart pounded as I fast-forwarded through the recording, searching for anything that could explain how Marina's dress ended up in Emily's room. And then I saw it. There, on the screen, was Marina. She entered Emily's room with the dress in hand, her movements careful and deliberate. She placed the dress in the wardrobe, smoothed her skirt, and exited without a trace of hesitation. The smug expression on her face was unmistakable. I leaned back in my chair, equal parts relieved and furious. Marina had gone too far, and now I had the proof to expose her. When Emily returned, she looked visibly shaken. Marcus must have told her about the accusations because she entered the library with a look of quiet dread. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. I gestured for her to sit. "Marina claims she found one of her dresses in your wardrobe," I said. "She's accusing you of theft." Emily's face paled, and her hands clenched into fists. "I didn't take anything," she said, her voice firm despite the tears welling in her eyes. "I would never." "I know," I interrupted gently, "and I can prove it." Her eyes widened in surprise as I turned my laptop toward her and played the footage. Together, we watched as Marina's deception unfolded on the screen. Emily covered her mouth with her hands, her disbelief palpable. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would she do this?" "Because she sees you as a threat," I said simply. "To her position, to her influence. But now, everyone will know the truth." That evening, I gathered the staff in the dining room. Marina stood among them, her expression confident, as if she believed her plan had succeeded. But when I played the footage for everyone to see, her confidence crumbled. "This is unacceptable," I said coldly, my gaze fixed on her. "You've not only tried to harm Emily's reputation, but you've also disrupted the peace of this household. Marina, you're dismissed. I want you out of this house by tomorrow." Marina's face twisted with anger and humiliation. "You're making a mistake, William," she hissed. "You'll regret this." But I didn't waver. As she stormed out of the room, I turned to Emily, who stood quietly by the doorway. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, there was nothing but gratitude and relief in her expression. "It's over," I said softly, but even as I said the words, I knew the battle wasn't truly finished. Marina's departure was only the first step. The scars she had left wouldn't heal overnight, and the storm she had stirred was far from over. Still, for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of hope, a fragile but growing belief that, together, we could weather whatever came next. The days following Marina's departure were quieter, but not without their challenges. The staff, though now fully aware of Marina's deceit, carried an unspoken tension in their movements. They were polite to Emily, perhaps out of guilt for their earlier behavior. But trust was still being rebuilt, and I could sense that Emily felt like an outsider despite her innocence. Michael, on the other hand, was blissfully unaware of the drama that had unfolded. His progress continued to astound me. He laughed more often now, his once muted presence growing brighter with each passing day. Emily had become an anchor in his life, and for that, I couldn't thank her enough. But even as life settled into a new rhythm, there was one matter weighing heavily on my mind: Jack. Emily had mentioned him several times in her quiet, heartfelt moments with Michael, describing the brother she had lost in the foster system and had spent years trying to find. Her longing to reunite with him was palpable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that helping her find Jack was the least I could do after everything she had done for my family. And so, I made some calls, with the resources at my disposal. It wasn't long before I had an answer. Jack was alive, living in a rough neighborhood in Queens with a foster family that, from what I gathered, cared little for his well-being. The reports I received described a boy who had grown up hardened by neglect and betrayal. It was clear that his situation was far from ideal. I debated how to tell Emily. This was the moment she had been waiting for, but I worried about the pain it might bring. When I finally gathered the courage to approach her, she was in the garden with Michael, watching as he carefully arranged a pile of leaves into what he proudly called his castle. "Emily," I said softly, motioning for her to join me. She looked up, her expression curious but calm. "I need to talk to you about something important," I began as we walked a little further from Michael, ensuring he wouldn't overhear. "It's about Jack." Her breath caught, and she stopped in her tracks. You found him," she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded. "He's in Queens, with a foster family. But the situation isn't good. He's been through a lot." For a moment, she didn't speak. Her hands clutched the hem of her sweater, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I need to see him," she said finally, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I'll take you," I said. "But you need to prepare yourself. He might not be the boy you remember." Emily nodded, though I could see the fear in her eyes. "I don't care," she said. "He's my brother. I have to try." That afternoon, we made the drive to Queens. The neighborhood was rough, the streets lined with cracked sidewalks and houses that had long since seen better days. The air was heavy with the sounds of arguments spilling from open windows and the distant blare of car horns. When we arrived at the address, Emily hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. "What if he doesn't want to see me?" she asked quietly. I reached over, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He's your brother, Emily. No matter how much time has passed, that bond doesn't just disappear." She nodded, drawing in a deep breath before stepping out of the car. I followed her to the door, standing just behind her as she knocked. The door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged man with a hardened face and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He looked us over with a mix of suspicion and irritation. "What do you want?" he asked gruffly. Emily straightened her back, though I could see the way her hands trembled. "I'm here to see Jack," she said, her voice steadier than I expected. "I'm his sister." The man raised an eyebrow, then let out a harsh laugh. "Sister? Huh? He doesn't have a sister. Never mentioned you before." Before Emily could respond, a figure appeared in the shadows behind him. A boy, taller than Emily but with a thin, wiry frame, stepped forward. His dark eyes were sharp, filled with suspicion and a hardness that made my chest tighten. "Jack," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. He stared at her, his face unreadable. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone cold. "It's me," Emily said, taking a cautious step forward. "It's Emily, your sister." For a moment, Jack didn't move. His gaze shifted between her and me, his body tense. Then he scoffed, crossing his arms. "I don't have a sister," he said. "If I did, she wouldn't have left me." Emily flinched as though he had struck her, but she didn't back down. "I didn't leave you," she said, her voice trembling. "They took us away from each other. I've been looking for you ever since." Jack's expression didn't soften. "Yeah, well, you didn't look hard enough." I could see the tears welling in Emily's eyes, but she held her ground. "I'm here now," she said, her voice firm. "And I'm not leaving without you." Jack stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. Finally, he shook his head and turned back toward the house. "Go away," he muttered. Emily started to follow him, but I gently caught her arm. "Give him time," I said quietly. She looked at me, her face crumpling under the weight of her emotions. "What if he never forgives me?" "He will," I said. "But it's going to take more than just words." As we walked back to the car, I could feel the storm brewing within her. Emily was determined, but the road ahead was going to test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. And as we drove away from that broken house, I couldn't help but wonder how much Jack's pain would shape the journey to come. The days after our visit to Queens were heavy with unspoken emotions. Emily had barely said a word on the ride back to the mansion. Her face betrayed a quiet determination. But I could see the weight she carried, the sting of Jack's rejection and the guilt she had been unable to let go of. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her that Jack's anger wasn't her fault. But I also knew that words would only do so much. Jack's wounds were deep, and it would take more than promises to bridge the years that had divided them. Michael sensed the change in Emily. He watched her closely, his curious gaze following her as she moved through the house with a subdued air. One afternoon, while Emily sat at the dining table staring at a photo of her and Jack as children, Michael approached her quietly, his small hand resting on her arm. "Emily," he said softly. She looked up, startled out of her thoughts. "What is it, sweetheart?" Michael hesitated, his dark eyes filled with concern. "Are you sad because of your brother?" Emily's lips parted in surprise, and she blinked rapidly, as if holding back tears. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's okay. Sometimes people need time to understand things." Michael nodded solemnly, his expression wise beyond his years. "He'll come back," he said with the quiet certainty only a child could possess. "You just have to keep trying." Emily's lips curved into a small, grateful smile, and she reached out to ruffle Michael's hair. "Thank you, Michael. You're a very smart boy." The interaction seemed to spark something in Emily. That evening, she asked me to arrange another visit to Queens. "Are you sure?" I asked, watching her carefully. "You saw how he reacted last time. I don't want you to get hurt again." "I have to try," she said firmly. "He's my brother. I can't give up on him." Her determination was unshakable. And so, a few days later, we made the drive back. This time, Emily brought something with her, a box filled with memories. Old photos, drawings Jack had made as a child, and a small stuffed bear that had been his favorite toy. When we arrived, the atmosphere was as tense as before. Jack answered the door this time, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Emily, then at me, and muttered, "What are you doing here?" "I just want to talk," Emily said, holding the box tightly. "Please." Jack hesitated, his jaw tightening. Then, with a begrudging sigh, he stepped aside. "Fine. But make it quick." We followed him into the small, cluttered living room. Jack slumped onto the worn-out couch, his arms crossed as he watched Emily warily. "I brought something for you," Emily said, setting the box on the coffee table. She opened it slowly, pulling out the photos first. "Do you remember this?" Jack glanced at the photo, a snapshot of them as children, laughing on a swing set. His expression softened. "If only for a moment." "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice low. "I've kept it all these years," Emily said. "I've been looking for you, Jack. I never stopped." Jack's gaze flickered to the other items in the box, the drawings, the stuffed bear. He reached out hesitantly, picking up the bear and turning it over in his hands. "I thought I lost this," he murmured. "You didn't," Emily said gently. "I held on to it for you. I've been holding on to everything I could, hoping one day I'd find you." Jack's expression wavered, the hardness in his eyes giving way to something more vulnerable. "Why now?" he asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Why did it take so long?" "I tried," Emily said, her voice breaking. "I went from one foster home to another. They moved me so many times. I lost track of where you were. When I aged out of the system, I had nothing, no resources, no way to find you. But I never gave up. I never stopped looking. Jack, you have to believe me." Jack stared at her, his grip tightening on the bear. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the distant hum of traffic outside. "I waited," he said finally, his voice trembling. "For years. I waited for you to come and take me away. But you never did." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I know," she whispered. "And I'm so sorry. I failed you, Jack. But I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere. I want to make things right. Please, let me try. Jack looked away. His jaw clenched. I don't know if I can trust you, he admitted. You don't have to trust me right away, Emily said. Her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. But I'll prove it to you. Whatever it takes. I'll prove it. For a moment, Jack didn't respond. Then he nodded. A small, reluctant motion that carried the weight of years of pain and uncertainty. Okay, he said quietly. Relief flooded Emily's face. And she reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Jack didn't pull away. And though it was a small gesture, it felt monumental. As we left the house that evening, I saw a spark of hope in Emily's eyes that hadn't been there before. The bridge between her and Jack was fragile, but it had been built. And in that moment, I knew she wouldn't stop until it was strong enough to withstand anything. In the weeks that followed, Emily and Jack's fragile bond began to take shape. It wasn't easy, Jack's defenses were high, and every step forward seemed to be accompanied by 2 steps back. Yet Emily's determination never wavered. She visited him regularly, bringing small gestures of goodwill, a hot meal, another keepsake from their childhood, or simply her presence. At first, Jack's responses were clipped and guarded, his body language screaming that he expected her to give up and leave, just as so many others had. But Emily, ever patient and unwavering, continued to show up. Each visit was a small reminder that she wasn't going to abandon him again. One Saturday, she asked Jack to come to the mansion. It's not just for me, she said softly. Michael would love to meet you. He's heard so much about you. Jack hesitated, his gaze flickering with uncertainty. I don't know if I'd fit in there, he muttered. You don't have to fit in, Emily said, her tone gentle but firm. You just have to be there. Please. Jack. Let me show you the life I've built, not because I want you to feel bad, but because I want you to see what's possible for us. Something in her voice must have reached him, because he finally nodded. Fine. But don't expect me to stay long, he said gruffly. When Jack arrived at the mansion, his unease was evident. His eyes darted around the grand foyer, taking in the marble floors and high ceilings with a mixture of awe and discomfort. I greeted him at the door, offering a handshake that he accepted reluctantly. Welcome, Jack, I said, keeping my tone warm but measured. I'm glad you came. He shrugged, avoiding my gaze. Emily wouldn't stop asking. Emily appeared then, her face lighting up when she saw him. Jack, she said, pulling him into a hug. He stiffened at first, but eventually, he relaxed, patting her back awkwardly. Michael ran in moments later, his excitement bubbling over. You're Jack, he asked, his wide eyes fixed on the older boy. Jack nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Yeah, that's me. Cool. Michael exclaimed. Emily says you're her little brother, but you're way taller than her now. That broke the tension, and Jack let out a quiet laugh. Yeah, I guess I am. The rest of the day was surprisingly peaceful. Emily and Michael took Jack on a tour of the mansion, showing him everything from the library to the garden. Michael, ever curious and eager, peppered Jack with questions, and though Jack remained guarded, I noticed his walls beginning to crack. During dinner, the conversation flowed easily, with Michael stealing the spotlight as he shared stories about his adventures with Emily. Jack listened intently, occasionally chiming in with a quip or a comment that made Michael giggle. By the time the evening ended, Jack's posture had softened. As he stood by the door, ready to leave, he turned to Emily. It's nice here, he admitted quietly. I can see why you stayed. Emily's eyes filled with emotion, and she reached out to squeeze his hand. It's not home without you, she said simply. Jack didn't respond, but the flicker of something, perhaps hope, crossed his face before he left. Over the next few weeks, Jack's visits became more frequent. Slowly but surely, he began to trust Emily again. They shared stories of their childhood, laughing over memories that had once been buried beneath years of pain. Jack even started to open up to me, though his conversations were short and often punctuated by awkward silences. One day, as we sat in the garden, he turned to me and said, "Why did you let her stay?" The question caught me off guard, but I answered honestly, "Because she needed help. And because she helped Michael in a way no one else could." Jack nodded, his expression thoughtful. "She's always been like that," he said quietly. "Even when we were kids, she'd take the blame for stuff I did just so I wouldn't get in trouble." "She loves you," I said. "She never stopped." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, I'm starting to see that." The real breakthrough came one evening when Jack stayed for dinner again. As we sat around the table, Michael asked Jack to help him with a puzzle he'd been struggling with. Jack, caught off guard, hesitated before nodding. As the two of them worked on the puzzle, Emily watched them with a soft smile. When Jack placed the final piece, Michael beamed. "We did it," he exclaimed, throwing his arms around Jack. Jack froze, clearly unaccustomed to such affection. But then he hugged Michael back. A hesitant but genuine gesture. Later, as Emily and I stood in the kitchen cleaning up, she turned to me, her eyes shining. "He's coming back to me," she said softly. "I can feel it." I placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her a small smile. "You've worked hard for this, Emily. You deserve it." And she did. Through her patience and unwavering love, she had begun to mend a bond that had seemed irreparably broken. Watching her and Jack rebuild their relationship was a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal with time, effort, and a little faith. For the first time in years, the mansion felt truly alive, not just a house, but a home where laughter and love had replaced the shadows of the past. And though the journey was far from over, I knew we were on the right path. Together, we were learning what it meant to be a family. As the sun set over the mansion, its golden rays casting a warm glow across the garden, it felt as though a chapter of healing and renewal had finally reached its culmination. Emily, Jack, Michael, and I sat together, sharing stories and laughter that now flowed freely, no longer bound by the chains of pain or distrust. The house, once filled with shadows, now brimmed with the vibrant energy of a family finding its way back to wholeness. Jack had begun to see Emily not as a distant figure from his past but as the sister who had always loved him, no matter the years apart. Michael's smile was a constant reminder of the resilience of the human spirit, his laughter echoing in the halls that had once known only silence. And for me, watching them together, I realized I had gained something priceless, a family that was built not just on blood, but on love, forgiveness, and second chances. This story, like life itself, is a testament to the power of hope and perseverance. If you've been inspired by this journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for more heartfelt stories from Life Stories. See you next time.